We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. I'd like to advise everyone that we have a hard stop at 5:30. So pursuant to the Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, June 23, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of allegations of political interference in the 2020 Nova Scotia mass murder investigation. With us today on the panel, we have the Honourable Bill Blair, President of the King's Privy Council and Minister of Emergency Preparedness, and Mr. Shaw Tupper, Deputy Minister, Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Welcome, gentlemen, and you have up to 5 minutes for opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for their invitation to once again appear before this committee on this matter. Let me begin by once again acknowledging the profound tragedy at the heart of this discussion. The events of April 18th and 19th in 2020 was the worst mass shooting in Canada's recent history. 22 people lost their lives, and their families and loved ones continue to mourn them. The senseless act of violence continues to reverberate throughout Nova Scotia and across Canada, and we cannot begin to fathom the grief and the loss caused by this event. On the matter before this committee today, I will begin by repeating part of my opening remarks from when I last appeared on this issue in July. At no point, Mr. Chair, did I direct the RCMP in any operational matter, including on public communications. I did not ask them to release any specific information, nor did I receive a promise for them to do so. And as you will find in all of my public statements from that time, I confirmed that identifying the weapons used was a decision wholly within the purview of the RCMP. My testimony on this point from July 25th continues to stand. The independence of police operations is a principle that I have not only respected but vigorously defended over my nearly 4 decades in law enforcement and throughout my subsequent career as a federal member of Parliament and minister. I would not, and I have not, ever directed police to release information pertaining to an investigation, nor did I do so in this case. I do understand that a recording of a call between the Commissioner and her subordinates has been identified by the RCMP and subsequently released by the Mass Casualty Commission. Neither I nor my office were participants on this call. My conversations with the RCMP during that period and generally throughout my time as Minister of Public Safety were with the Commissioner directly. I understand that Commissioner Lucky will be appearing in the second hour of today's meeting, and she will be far better placed to speak to specific details of what occurred between her and her subordinates. The order in council that was announced in May of 2020 had been the result of many, many months of work. I was, in fact, leading consultations across Canada alongside my former colleague, Minister Goodall, on the question of assault-style firearms and handguns as early as October of 2018. As a government, we first signaled our commitment to get assault-style weapons off our streets in the 2015 speech from the throne. Work on the OIC began almost immediately after I became the Minister of Public Safety, as it was one of the priorities given to me in my mandate letter from the Prime Minister. To put these regulations together, we needed to invest the time to get it right, and so this work was undertaken throughout the fall of 2019 and the spring of 2020. And through this OIC, Mr. Chair, we banned 1,500 plus of some of the most dangerous weapons that were at that time still legal in Canada. These are weapons that were designed to kill people and to do so efficiently. Weapons that were captured in the OIC were used in the Polytechnique massacre, in the Fredericton shooting of 2 police officers, in Moncton and Meyerthorpe, at Quebec City Mosque. The AR-15 alone has been used in some of the most deadly mass casualty events in the United States within the last decade, perhaps most profoundly and concerningly, including the horrific murders of little kids at Sandy Hook. Mr. Chair, gun violence is a complex problem, and combating it requires complex solutions. The order in council was a significant and positive step forward for the safety of Canadians, but that work, as you know, is not done, and just over a week ago, the Prime Minister announced a freeze on the sale, purchase, and transfer of handguns. I also understand that your committee is currently examining legislation from my colleague, Minister Mendicino, on this very issue in Bill C-21. Mr. Chair, we continue with this work as a government because we know that effective gun control regulations can save lives. Our first priority has been and will always be to ensure the safety of all Canadians. I thank the committee for their attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Minister. We will start our rounds of questions right now with Ms. Dancho. Please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. I think you know what I'm going to ask you, Minister, so let's just get right to it, shall we? In the audio recording, the Minister said that she flew up the flagpole because it was a request that from the Minister's office. I shared with the Minister that, in fact, it was going to be in the news release. Now, you've directly refuted this in committee, so how do you explain that?
Thank you very much, Ms. Dancho. I explained it with just the truth. The reality is, in all my conversations with the Commissioner, at no time did I direct her, ask her, or even suggest that she release that information. At no time did the Commissioner promise me that she was going to do it. I think you're referring to a conversation that the Commissioner had with her subordinates, of which I was not a party. I can't and won't speculate on what was going on in that conversation.
You feel that
I can simply advise you that the fact is I never
truth.
Directed her in that way.
She also said further along, she said yet again, not that the Minister on the simplest of requests. So she's saying this word request several times. She also said that she got confirmation, that she confirmed to your office. Now you're saying that did not occur. She did not confirm to you or anyone in your office that this weapons info would be released. Is that correct?
That information was never shared with me. I can say that with absolute certainty because I recall very vividly and I would remind you, Mr. Dancho, on both April 25th and again on May 1st, when asked about the guns that were used in that offense, I made it very clear, very publicly in my response to the media that it was the sole responsibility of the RCMP.
She said at committee as well, she said, I asked her specifically, the Minister of Public Safety at the time, Bill Blair, specifically asked you if weapons used during the attack would be mentioned in the press conference of April 28th. She said yes. She then said, I asked her, so you confirmed to Minister Blair when he asked you if weapons information would be released in the press conference that yes, it would be, correct? She said yes to that question. So was Commissioner Lucky not telling the truth, Minister?
I think Commissioner Lucky has told the truth. And in fact, I would remind you that when she came before this committee, she was explicit and clear that at no time did she receive any direction from me, nor was there any interference with government, with the RCMP's decision to release that information.
I'm not asking about direction, Minister. I'm asking specifically about what Commissioner Lucky said. In the Mass Casualty Commission, she also said, I got asked if the media event would include the details of the guns. To which Rachel Young, the Crown prosecutor, asked, who were you asked by? I was asked by the Chief of Staff of the Minister. Were you aware that the Chief of Staff made this request of Commissioner Lucky? I was not aware of that. Frankly, it was not something that I was at all concerned with. I believed, and as I believe now, it was entirely the purview of the RCMP to determine if and when that information should be released. Minister, you're saying that your Chief of Staff acted solely on her own in making this request? My understanding subsequently is that the Commissioner had indicated to both my Chief of Staff and the Deputy Minister that she'd made a decision to release that information, and then apparently it wasn't subsequently released. So you were not familiar that your Chief of Staff made this request to Commissioner? Just to be clear, you were not aware that your Chief of Staff made the request to the Commissioner to release the gun information at the press conference? And Ms. Dancho, I believe that's not correct. I do not believe that my Chief of Staff asked the Commissioner to release that information, and in fact that contradicts your assertion, contradicts the statement by the Commissioner, who's made it very clear that no one in government, neither myself nor anyone in government, asked her to do that. It's not my assertion, Minister. It is the words of the Commissioner, Commissioner Lucky.
Ms. Demoff on a point of order.
Just with respect to the, out of respect for the interpreters, it's difficult for them to do their jobs when two people are talking at once.
May I continue?
Ask everyone to take turns. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Minister. So you're saying that the Commissioner was not telling the truth when she told her deputies that your office made this request. She was not telling the truth.
Conversation between the Commissioner and her subordinates was not something I was a party to, and I'm not going to speculate
Minister,
on
she also
her
said it
reasons
at
for saying what she
committee.
did.
She also said it at committee. So was she not telling the committee members here the truth?
She has testified under oath, Ms. Dancho, that she was not directed or asked by any member of government, including myself, to release that
Minister,
information.
I'm not asking about direction. I'm asking very specifically about the request made from your Chief of Staff. She said it here at committee that happened. She said it at the Mass Casualty Commission. Are you saying that never happened, that the Commissioner was not telling the truth? And again, my understanding from the Commissioner was that she had advised both the Deputy Minister and my Chief that she had made a decision to release that information, and then subsequently was concerned that it had not been released. Minister, but you're directly contradicting what the Commissioner said in testimony here and at the Mass Casualty Commission. Are you not concerned that the Commissioner is not telling the truth and that you're here as a result? Ms. Dancho, all I can do is come before this committee
and testify honestly about what I know and what happened, and that's what I'm
So
doing.
how do you explain the Commissioner's words to the committee members here and the mass casualty? She made it very clear that the request came from your Chief of Staff. And just to be clear before you answer, everyone here is well aware of how the Chief of Staff and ministerial relationship works. I doubt very much that your Chief of Staff went rogue and made this request without your knowledge, let alone without telling you following that request being made. Are you expecting us to believe that, Minister, that your Chief of
Two
Staff
things. Whenever anybody
went
begins a
rogue?
question with "everybody knows," it's usually a good reminder that some people just simply don't know how things work.
I think
but
you're
let me
obfuscating a
also
bit,
clarify
Minister.
what the Commissioner said should be clarified by the Commissioner. She's going to be appearing here in the next hour. I'd
Yes.
certainly invite you to put any questions about what the Commissioner may have said. But I'm here to tell you about what I did and what I've said. And
I'm
I've done
asking
that
you
today.
about the Commissioner's words. She's directly refuting you on the record. She did that over the summer at committee. She did that to the Mass Casualty Commission. Are you not concerned that her words directly refute yours? Is that not a concern to you, sir?
I don't believe that's true. Frankly,
Oh,
I've heard
okay,
a great
so
deal
she's not telling the truth.
conjecture and
Thank you, Ms.
innuendo from you, Mr. both in Parliament and outside. And frankly, I don't believe what you are saying is true.
It's on the record.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Dancho. We go now to Mr. New Mohammed for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for appearing, though I am certain you have better things to do than to be engaged in this political theater. I just wanted to begin where Ms. Dancho left off, because I am actually quite disturbed that we are now mired in what appears to be misinformation by omission. So I just want to be clear that in my view, what Ms. Dancho just portrayed is not what I believe to have been the case. So I just want to give you the opportunity, because I want to get this on the record once and for all, having recognized you've done this several times. Have you been telling your truth? Have you been telling the truth in every appearance that you have had before, in every question that you've had before this committee and before Parliament, when you've been asked a question?
The answer is yes, sir. In every answer that I have given to this committee, in my previous appearance and today, and in every answer I've given into the House, I have spoken the truth.
And Minister, do you believe that the Commissioner has been telling the truth in the answer that she has given?
I think that's a question best put to the Commissioner. I think in fairness to her and out of respect for the position that she holds, I think she should be allowed to speak for herself and to explain, for example, the conversation she had with her subordinates. All I can say is about the interactions that I had directly with her and what I myself have done, and I've done my very best to convey that honestly and forthrightly to this committee and to Parliament.
Minister, a lot of attention is being focused on this view that your office asked if something would or would not be included in a press conference. How often during the course of the operation of your office do you think the question, is this going to be included in something, or is this going to be done, asked, do you think?
Things that does happen throughout an event like this mass casualty event. It is, as I've said, one of the worst shooting events. Many Canadians had lost their lives. A community and a country had been traumatized by this terrible event. And there were, quite understandably, briefings that were taking place directly with the RCMP Commissioner and with other officials about what had transpired. And for example, information was somewhat slowly coming to us about this event. And I think the Commissioner was working diligently through that in order to provide briefings to the government. But I have to tell you, there's a very clear line, my friend, about how we speak to the Commissioner about this information. It's a line that I'm quite familiar with. I was, as you know, for many years, a police leader myself and had to speak to those to whom I was accountable and provided briefings to. But that line is crystal clear in my mind, not to give direction to the RCMP, and it's a principle I have always respected.
And so, Mr., just to be clear, what I'm trying to get at is that is it reasonable that when your office is asking a question, that they're actually just asking a question because they would like an answer versus giving a direction in the asking of that question? That is to say, is X or Y going to be included is because they're curious if X or Y is going to be included versus somehow that being intuited into a direction?
It's one of the reasons on April 20th, when I was speaking at a press conference beside the Commissioner, and again on April 25th, and then subsequently on May 1st, I always preface my remarks saying that information about the investigation, the release of information, or any aspect of the investigation was solely the responsibility of the RCMP. And I was actually trying to be very clear, not only to Canadians, but to my government and all of us, about the importance of respecting the principle of police independence. This was a very difficult investigation for the RCMP. There were a lot of questions about what had transpired. People had a desperate need for information, and we respected that. But it is ultimately the RCMP's responsibility to provide that information.
Thank you, Minister. And in the last moments that I have, just wanted to clarify two things, just because, let's just do it one more time. Did you ever instruct the Commissioner of the RCMP to release any information at your direction?
No, and if I may be very clear, I did not direct her. I did not instruct her. I didn't ask her to do it. I didn't even suggest it should be done. It is, in my opinion, her decision.
And so if any information was chosen to be released, we can sit here confidently knowing that that would have been the decision of the Commissioner of the RCMP alone, and not you, not the Prime Minister, not political staff, no one.
RCMP, the Commissioner, is the head of that organization.
Thank you, Minister. I think that's all I have. Mr. Chair, I think I may be out of time.
You have 1 minute left.
Oh, I do. Okay. Perfect. In that case, I do have one more question for you, Minister, if I might. Minister, this is, as we all know, one of the most horrific tragedies in the history of this country. Communities have been traumatized, and, regrettably, we are now having to understand much of what happened. The Mass Casualty Commission is doing its work. This committee is going through this process right now. What is your message to those that may see this in some way, shape, or form as undermining the credibility of the RCMP and of our public safety institutions in this country? What would you say to Canadians who are watching this to reassure them that we can have confidence in our police forces?
I think one of the greatest principles of trust in the police is that they are an institution which is accountable to the people they're sworn to serve and protect. And in these circumstances, it's one of the reasons that our government brought forward a commission of inquiry to answer certain questions with respect to, for example, RCMP communications, the actions that were taken in response to the shootings, including in the critical incident response, the services that were provided for victim services. Transparency and accountability to the public is foundational and a principle of trust in our policing institutions. And I think it is incumbent. I've been through this previously in another role that I've held. It's incumbent upon the police to explain their actions and to be accountable to the people they're sworn to serve and protect, and the families of the people who lost loved ones in this terrible tragedy. They need answers, and they need our compassion and our respect. And that's why, as well, the report of the Mass Casualty Commission will be so important to them.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Now, over to Ms. Michaud. Ms. Michaud, 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. It's appreciated that you've returned to testify on this topic. In your opening statement on July 25th, when you were here last at committee, you said, "Let's be clear, I never directed the RCMP on an operational matter, including for public communications. I didn't ask for the publication of information, and I wasn't promised that it would be done," in reference to Commissioner Lucky. Yet, Ms. Lucky, in April of 2020,
from the minister's office, and I shared with the minister that in fact it was going to be in the news release, and it wasn't. Fin de la citation.
end of quote. I know you've said a number of times that you never promised anything. You never had Ms. Lucky promise anything. But in the transcript, she really seems to confirm that's what she was talking about. So, if it wasn't about revealing the type of weapon at the time, what was she referring to in your opinion? And I know that you say you weren't part of that conversation, so it's difficult. You can't speculate. But if she wasn't talking specifically about revealing the firearms, what was she talking about in your opinion?
And again, I don't want to speculate. I can tell you that I had no direct conversation with the Commissioner, and my interactions with the RCMP were almost in every case directly with the Commissioner. The Commissioner never advised me personally that it was her intention and her decision to release that information. Now, I've understand subsequently from her testimony that she had passed that information on to someone in my office, but we never had the conversation because, quite frankly, I'd never asked her to do that. I never thought she was going to. Frankly, I didn't really think it was particularly necessary. It was a decision I believe the commissioner had come to on her own, and she had shared her decision with my office, but it wasn't something that I had requested or required of her.
Justement, vous dites
You say that it wasn't directly with you. Perhaps it was with a member of your office, of your staff. Perhaps you weren't aware. When the transcript became public, did you check with your team, the team you had at the time when you were Minister of Public Safety, to ensure that it's not direction that came from your office without you being aware of it?
I'm absolutely certain it was not direction from my office. And the Commissioner has in fact confirmed that in her own testimony, both here and before the Mass Casualty Commission, that at no time was she directed, and her words are not by any government official, which would have included everyone in my office. But I will also say, because it was not something I had ever asked of her or required of her, the fact that she had made a decision to do it and then it didn't happen was not terribly relevant to me, and not something that I felt I needed to follow up with the Commissioner, because it was not something that, quite frankly, I had sought or required or directed her to do.
vous parlez de follow.
You talk about follow-up, and in the transcript from April 28th, 2020, Commissioner Lucky says that after the press conference, she received a request that the minister wanted to talk to her, referencing you, so that he wanted to know what it was about. When we listen to you, we understand that you don't seem to be at the same place. She seems to say that you wanted to talk about revealing the firearms during the press conference. Did that conversation happen between you two after the press conference, and if so, on what topic?
I have no recollection of having that conversation, but it most certainly did not involve the release of information with respect to the weapons used. That was not something, frankly, I was even aware that the Commissioner had made the decision to release that information. I had said, sitting next to her at a press conference on the 20th, the 25th, and then again on May 1st, that was up to the RCMP to make a determination on if and when any information related to the investigation should be revealed. And the Commissioner, I don't have any recollection of requiring a call with the Commissioner. I was receiving briefings from her, but it was not something that I reached out to her and was waiting to speak to her. I think the Commissioner herself will have to explain her comments there.
Si c'est une requête.
If it's a request that didn't come from you directly or your office, do you think it may have come from the Prime Minister's office, for example?
I absolutely believe that is not true. Under Section 5.1 of the RCMP Act, there is only one person in the Government of Canada who has any authority to provide direction to the RCMP, and that's the Minister of Public Safety, a role I held at the time. And in that role, I did not at any time give direction. And that's confirmed, in my opinion, by Commissioner Lucky's testimony both before this committee and before the Mass Casualty Commission, in which he was very explicit and under oath, said that she received no direction from any member of the government, including myself.
Ce qui vient rendre ce témoignage.
What makes this testimony a little curious is that it's not the only thing that makes us think that those conversations may have taken place, because the Director of Strategic Communications in Halifax, Leah Scanlon, said about the same thing, that government representatives and the Prime Minister wanted to control the message at that time, so that direction would have come from your office and the Prime Minister's office. What do you respond to that?
I've never met Ms. Scanlon. I have no insight into her comments or her speculation. I have no idea how she came to those conclusions. I think that's a question better put to her.
Merci. Je
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. McGregor, please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister Blair, for appearing before our committee again. Again, I think the big reason why this committee is meeting today is because of the appearance of that word request twice in the transcript of the recording. First, when the Commissioner is referring to a request that she got from the Minister's office, and secondly, when she complained of not being able to come through for the Minister on, quote, the simplest of requests. Now, this recording and its transcript have been public now for a little while, and we're really trying to drill down to the meaning of that word request. Sir, in the conversations you've had with your office, because I don't doubt for a second that your office has been talking about this transcript and what it means, have you come to any conclusion through conversations with your staff, your chief of staff, to what on earth the commissioner is referring to when she states this twice during a recorded phone call to her subordinates?
And Mr. McGregor, if I may be really clear, I was not a party to this conversation.
No, I understand that,
but
but what,
the commission,
I mean, surely your staff could have, said, well, maybe she thought it was this, because we're just trying to understand why would the commissioner refer to this word twice in a recorded phone call to her subordinates so closely after being in conversation with your office?
And Mr. McGregor, you're asking me to engage in speculation and conjecture, and I don't believe that's appropriate. The commissioner herself will be here before this committee in less than an hour's time. And the question you may want to put to her, but you're asking me about a conversation I was not a party to. You're asking me about things that someone else said and asking me to explain why she might have said it. You have an opportunity to ask the person who actually spoke those words what she meant and why she said it. And I'm sure that you'll take that opportunity. But I am not going to engage in speculation or conjecture about what she said or what she may have meant.
Okay, granted, Minister, I understand. So you've come up with no theories as to why she may have used that words, and you don't want to engage in that. Fine. Those quotes were wrapped around a series of complaints to her subordinates based on how the RCMP was communicating with the public. And there was a second quote in the middle of those two words where she states, quote, does anybody realize what's going on in the world of handguns and guns right now? The fact that they're trying, in the middle of trying to get legislation going, the fact that legislation is supposed to actually help police, and the fact that very little information I asked to be put in speaking notes could not be accommodated. So we have the reference to a request from the minister's office. We have the complaint about what this is tied to. Minister, do you not see how this committee cannot, how could we not infer from these comments that the request from your office, as she's referring to, is not tied to the creating of a public narrative coming up with the OIC that was announced on May 1st of 2020? How can we not infer that?
Well, quite frankly, you're free to engage in any speculation, conjecture, or innuendo. It's like that's one of the privileges of a member of Parliament to come to their own conclusions. I can only tell you what the facts were. And the fact is, I nor any member of our government never at any time directed the commissioner to release this information. And she's confirmed the truth of that. And the reasons why she said those things to her subordinates, a question you may wish to put to the commissioner. I can tell you that certainly it was no secret that our government had made a commitment. It was in the Throat speech in 2015. You'll probably remember it.
I do.
It was also something we campaigned on rather vigorously in 2019.
I understand that.
It was in all the papers. I'm sure you recall it.
Yes.
It was in my mandate letter, and I know as a member of this committee you probably read that.
On the record, sir. Okay. I understand the timeline with the OIC. I understand that it was in works very much. Let's forget for a moment about the questions on requests from your office. Under Section 5.1, you do have, it provides for the appointment of the commissioner who, under the direction of the minister, has control and management of the force. Do you think it was appropriate for the commissioner to be using briefings in Nova Scotia to push your government's legislation, as it seems she is clearly doing in the recording? Do you feel that's appropriate for the commissioner to be doing in your role as the Minister of Public Safety? Shouldn't the policy and the politics part of it be coming from your office and not from the commissioner?
I can speak to the politics of it from my role as a minister of the government and the Minister of Public Safety.
I asked for the appropriateness, sir, though, of the commissioner in that recording.
You're asking me to pass a judgment on a conversation the commissioner had with her
I'm asking you to pass
subordinates.
judgment as her direct superior.
Well, and
You
as her direct
you had a role
superior,
to play as a Minister of Public Safety.
but keeping in mind that in many respects is an operational matter, that the commissioner was having a conversation with her subordinates about an operational issue which always includes the release of public information, and so how the commissioner chose to do that and how she chooses to explain herself, I'll leave that quite appropriately to her. I will tell you, let me just share with you, there was only one incident in the time that I was the Minister of Public Safety that I issued any directive to the RCMP. I did it by ministerial directive. It was done in writing. It was made public. And it was a ministerial directive that prescribed time limits for the RCMP response to ATIP requests. And it was the only time I exercised that authority under Section 5.1 of the RCMP Act to issue a directive to the RCMP.
My final 20 seconds, Minister, I want to get one request. Will you table with our committee all emails and communications between your office and Commissioner Lucky that happened between April 18th and 28th that relate to the mass shooting and its aftermath? Will you table those with our committee, sir?
Well, and let me be clear. I have always responded to requests from this committee. And I might suggest, Mr. Chair, that if this committee makes a decision to request certain documentation then subject to issues of privilege and classified information, I will always cooperate and always have cooperated with this committee in providing the documentation that I'm able to provide it.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. That ends the first round of questions. We start the second round with Ms. Dancho. We probably will have to abbreviate this round at some point. So go ahead, please, Ms. Dancho, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Did you communicate with the commissioner or anyone from your staff communicate with the commissioner or her staff using any apps, or was it just email, phone calls, text messages?
Oh, my communications primarily with the commissioner were direct, face-to-face, or sometimes...
What about your chief of staff? How was she
know.
communicating? You don't know?
I don't know. I will tell you the only apps I use is my parliamentary email account, and I also use text messaging that's available on the phones provided.
Thank you very much. Did you do any prep work with the PMO in the lead up to this meeting?
No.
No? Did you do any prep work with Commissioner Lucky or her staff? Did you talk to her in the lead up to this?
My last direct conversation with the commissioner, I think you were present when we were at the musical ride
Right.
at the college, and I spoke briefly to the commissioner, and you were standing beside me at the time.
Minister, I'm going to ask you very specifically. So this is what Commissioner Lucky said in testimony at the MCC under oath, as you've said. I'm going to quote her. This is verbatim. I was asked questions from the Chief of Staff, quote, will this be included? Are the details of firearms going to be included in this media event, end quote. I tell the Chief of Staff, yeah, you know what? It's going to be part of this big event. What's your response to that? Do you believe that she was lying about your Chief of Staff saying that?
No, but let me be very clear, though. The
You have
question
not
is,
been clear, sir.
Well, perhaps not to you, Ms. Dancho, but if I may. What you have just read to us was not my Chief of Staff giving any direction to the Commissioner of RCMP, but just asking
Okay,
what the
so
RCMP
Minister,
have
pardon me,
decided
but
to
you're
do.
not. So you're not denying that your Chief of Staff asked her this. That's new.
Well,
Okay.
frankly, I don't know.
I'm
You're
glad
talking
that
about a
we've
conversation in
established
which
that
I was
finally.
not party, but what you have just read to me is not in any way giving direction to the RCMP.
We're not
it's
asking about
information for a
direction,
briefing.
Minister, and you're well aware of that. We're asking if pressure was put on the Commissioner, even subtly, from your office. If the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Public Safety, to whom the Commissioner is responsible to, if your Chief of Staff is speaking, it's on your behalf. And if she's asking the Commissioner, as you've just confirmed, you've not denied this, are those weapons going to be released? That is pressure. Do you not see that, Minister? That's why we are here today. That's why this saga has gone on for 5 months. A ministerial directive does not preclude political interference, Minister.
Well,
I will go on to ask a few more
if you don't want a
questions.
response to
She
that,
also said,
I have one.
She also said, she made it very clear, and my colleague alluded to this, that she had to apologize to you. She said, quote, this is what it says in the audio recording, not being able to come through for the minister on the simplest of requests. Further on, she says, quote, I already have a request sitting in my phone that the minister wants to speak with me, and I know exactly what it's going to be about. So she looks like she's very responsible to you for this information not being released in the press conference, and yet you're denying that this never happened. You denied on the record in committee that you didn't even know she was going after this information, and yet she's telling her staff, quite indignantly, in an audio recording, that she's going to have to apologize for you for failing to deliver that information publicly. And you're denying that ever happened. You're expecting us to believe that, Minister.
It's the truth, Ms. Dancho, and let me
So
be...
Commissioner Lucky is lying then,
Ms. Dancho, could you let the minister answer, please?
if he would answer it.
Thank you very
Chair.
much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the opportunity to respond to that. To be very clear, the Commissioner of the RCMP I never spoke to her about this, and she never apologized to me. What she said to her subordinates is something you can ask her about as to why she said it, but I can confirm for this committee that I did not ask the Commissioner to do this. She never promised me she would.
Yes, you've
there
said
was
that,
no
Minister.
call outstanding with me, and in fact, at no time has the Commissioner
So that
ever
call
offered
never
any kind of an
happened.
apology, because quite frankly, none was required.
So just to confirm, she was not telling the truth then. She was not telling the truth on that audio recording. You never called her after. You never spoke to her on April 28th. You never spoke to her on that day.
I have no recollection at all of ever having a conversation with her on that date or about that issue.
Did she ever make any apologies to you at any time during this saga in April 2020?
No?
She never made a single apology to you, because in the audio recording she said that would have been her fourth apology to you.
She did not apologize.
She's never apologized to you. So the commissioner really was telling a long tale in this audio recording. Are you not concerned that the head of our RCMP is saying that many mistruths about you and your chief of staff, both on MCC testimony, in this committee, and to her subordinates as she's reprimanded? You have no concern that she was making that all up?
I can only come before this committee and tell the facts, which is the truth. She was not directed by me. The commissioner has not apologized to me. It wasn't necessary for her to apologize for me because she did not do or fail to do anything
I will
that
just
I'd asked her, because I
conclude,
hadn't asked her
Mr.
to do
Chair, with
that.
my final 10 seconds. Again, Commissioner, Minister, we're not asking you about direction. We're asking you about political interference. Any request from your office would have been pressure, and that would have been political interference into the worst mass killing criminal investigation in Canadian history. And just on the record, you've denied all of the words that she said to be true, and yet you have not fired her. I find that shocking. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Learn to live with the shock, Ms. Stancho, but the reality is that the commissioner was not directed, and she's been forthright and truthful in her testimony that there was no interference and that she received no direction from me or any member of this government. That's, in fact, the truth.
Chang? Mr. Chang, 5 minutes, please. Did I get that wrong? Mr. Sobera?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today. It's always great to be in your company, Minister. Just wanted to put something on record with regards to on July 25th regarding whether inquiries are asking for information as interference, and I believe Commissioner Lucky, I just want to make sure I have my notes, is stated that. In quotation marks, keeping the government informed through timely and accurate information sharing is not interference, it's standard procedure, and these situational updates are provided without compromising the operational integrity of an investigation. Is that those are Commissioner's words, and that's fair
the
to
Commissioner's
say?
absolutely correct. And in fact, we receive very regular briefings on matters of law enforcement, of national security, of national security intelligence. We are frequently briefed and provided with information on their responsibilities.
And that would be standard practice of whichever government is in power.
Yes, and in fact, I've been involved in similar briefings sitting on the other side of the table with previous governments.
Absolutely, and that would be also at the provincial level or any other level of jurisdiction.
That's correct, sir.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Just moving on for that, because I think it's very important to put that on the record because we want to be able to separate fact from fiction. Minister, given your long and extensive professional background, can you speak more and further about police operational independence and why it's so important?
Yeah, as I've said many times in the House, Mr. Sorbera, I think it's a principle that underpins the rule of law. You know, we in our Canadian criminal justice system, we have always respected the independence of the police, and that they can never be subject to political interference. I'll just give an example I cited today in the House. 2 years ago, a member from the Conservative caucus rose in the House and demanded why the government hadn't released information on search warrants and production orders and even a closed warrant. And I had to explain to him at that time that it is never the responsibility or the authority of the government to make decisions with respect to the release of that information. It is solely the purview of the police. And throughout my career as a police officer, and I've dealt with a number of sensitive national security matters and serious criminal matters as well. And briefing government is a very different thing, if I may, than receiving direction from the government. And there has been a number of occasions in the past where perhaps a politician not understanding that principle very clearly made an attempt to recommend a certain course of action. But I think it is a principle always vigorously defended and now well understood that there are no circumstances in which there should be a political interference in operational or investigative decisions of the RCMP. It's an allegation made in the past, one we've learned from. And if I may, I would also cite Justice Linden's public inquiry into the Ipperwash. I think there was a very clear articulation of where that line is and how it must never be crossed.
Of course. And if I can follow up in my remaining time to the Deputy Minister, if you can further elaborate, and how does Public Safety Canada work in say, conjunction or collaboration with the RCMP as an independent agency, especially for folks out there who are, may not be versed on in terms of how agencies cooperate and how government works with an agency such as the RCMP?
10 days on the job, I'll try and measure that out, but 38 years of public service. So within a portfolio like the one that I now lead, I will work closely with all of the heads of those agencies in the development of advice for the government, and that would be a key part of my responsibilities, is to engage with, in the instance of the RCMP, with the Commissioner, to make sure that as we are engaged in the development of advice, that it would include the expertise that can be offered by any of the portfolio agencies in the formulation of that advice. So it would be a regular thing, and indeed I have plans to meet regularly with all the heads of the agencies to ensure that we're pulling together the best advice for the government.
Thank you. Mr. Chang, can you get a question in from 1 minute?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My apologies for not chiming in earlier. Minister Blair, you have made it clear that you firmly believe in the operational independence of law enforcement in Canada. As a former police officer for 39 years, where you were chief of police for the last 10 years, could you elaborate on your perspective surrounding operational independence again? And why is it so important that elected officials can never influence the action of independent, nonpartisan public servants?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chang. And I think it really comes down to an issue of public trust. And if the public are going to trust that the police will follow the rule of law, that they will act in the public interest, there can never be a suggestion that they are acting out of a political interest. And that's why someone once said to me, it's a gray line, and it's not. It's a bright line. It's a bright line that stands and needs to be defended and acknowledged and recognized between any political interference or even the appearance of political interference with operational decisions, including who to investigate, how that investigation will follow a certain course, and includes the release of certain information pertaining to that investigation. I think there may be, and I think there's always suggestions and allegations from people who perhaps don't understand where that bright line is, that, for political reasons, some of that information should be released. But I believe most vigorously that that's never the case. And Mr. Chang, not only in my previous career as the chief of the Toronto Police Service, but also in my advocacy as the president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, there were a number of times that with previous governments, I have stood for that principle as I stand for it now. And it's a principle not only that I respect and vigorously defend, but it was a principle that was honored and respected throughout this very tragic event that occurred in Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Chang.
Thank you.
On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud.
Now, Ms. Michaud. Ms. Michaud, go ahead, please. 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, according to the report on the MASH Casualty Commission, on April 20th, 2020, according to Superintendent Daryl Campbell, it was said that she promised you and the Prime Minister that she would disclose the weapons used during the killing, even if that could compromise the investigation, as Mr. Campbell said, because she knew that you would be publishing something 2 days later and that releasing the weapons would assist the government. Do you agree with me that releasing information like the weapons used during the killing could have compromised the investigation?
Actually, Ms. Michaud, the fact that the RCMP investigators believed that it could compromise that investigation is good enough for me. But as well, just to be very clear, I didn't ask the Commissioner to release that information. I've always said it is solely the responsibility of the RCMP, who's responsible for those operational investigative decisions, to decide when and if that information was released. I said that publicly, by the way, on April 20th. I repeated it publicly again at a press conference on the 25th, and I said it once again on May 1st at a press conference that it's only the RCMP that can make that decision. And frankly, if the RCMP said the release of that information would have the possibility of compromising that investigation, that's not something, quite frankly, I would question. It's not something that I would disagree with. It's their decision, and I respect that.
It's curious that 2 days later, 2 days after Commissioner Lucky applied pressure, or allegedly did, on Superintendent Campbell so that he would reveal the weapons used. You announced the May 1st declaration that would prohibit certain types of assault weapons and the weapons that were used during the mass murder in Portapique. It's curious that that happened right after. And I know you've been working on this for a long time. You said in 2018 you worked on that prohibition for certain types of assault weapons, but it gives the impression that you were reacting to this sad event, perhaps to have public approval. And I think that might be what happened with C-21. It was announced just a few days after the mass murder in Texas. That was horrible. So could you confirm that it's a coincidence that this was announced just a few days after the mass murder?
I wouldn't characterize it as a coincidence. The prohibition of assault-style rifles, for me, has been a very important goal since the mass shooting in Sandy Hook in which 22 little kids got killed. There have been numerous mass shootings involving these weapons since. In Canada, I've been to the funerals of the police officers that were killed in Moncton and in Fredericton and in Meyerthorpe. I've also attended a number of vigils for the worshippers that were killed at the mosque in Quebec City and at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. I've attended every year vigils for the women that were killed at École Polytechnique. And so when there was a mass shooting in Nova Scotia, we had been working for several months, years in fact, in compiling the list of the weapons to be prohibited. And we were working with the Canadian Firearm Program and others in developing that list. I had done consultations across the country. And when that mass murder took place in Nova Scotia, for me, it was a last straw. Deep in my resolve, we had to act, and we acted. It wasn't a coincidence, but neither was it exploiting that terrible tragedy. It was responding to that terrible tragedy and saying never again.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to have to cut you off there. Mr. McGregor, please go ahead, 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, Minister, we've referenced Section 5.1 of the RCMP Act a few times here, and it provides for the appointment of a commissioner who, under the direction of the minister, has control and management of the force. Now, I appreciate that you understand the line. You've stated that you understand the line between your role, former role as Minister of Public Safety, and the Commissioner of the RCMP. But I think the wording of this act is sufficiently vague to allow it to be open to interpretation. And we know previous federal governments have gotten in trouble with direction of the RCMP. Previous Chrétien government, the Diefenbaker government, there are examples. Now, we have examples in Canada, Ontario's Police Service Act, the Manitoba Police Services Act, where they do specify that the board shall not give the chief of police any kind of operational decisions. They took the time to put the specificity of that language. We have jurisdictions abroad, like the South Australia Victoria Police Act, which goes on to specify all of the matters where the minister may not give the police directions, including enforcement of the law, investigation or prosecution of offenses. So there are examples legislatively around the world where jurisdictions have taken the time to add more specificity to the law. My question to you, sir, is would you support an effort to add that kind of specificity to Section 5.1 so that ministers of public safety into the future understand clearly where the difference lies between what their role is and what the Commissioner of the RCMP's role? Would you support efforts to add specificity, as we do have examples, not only here in Canada but abroad?
Well, I'm quite familiar, by the way, with the Ontario Police Services Act, something I worked under for a very long time. And I would also point out to you just how
But on the question.
And if I may get to your question, okay. I promise. I'd invite you to go and have a look at the mandate letter that was provided to Commissioner Lucky upon her appointment, that was provided by the then Minister of Public Safety, in which is a very clear and explicit articulation that the government will not and must never interfere.
With respect, a mandate letter does not have the same force as a statute of Canada.
No, and I understand that, but I just wanted to share with you because I think it's clear that our government declared that principle right up front and made it public.
To my question, sir.
And to your question, there's a number of legislative remedies that I think might be worthy of consideration of perhaps this committee or Parliament. And if you bring forward such recommendations, I would certainly look at them with a very open mind, because I think it is incumbent upon us to make sure that the law is clear and that important principles like the independence of the police are clearly recognized in law. It's a principle that I certainly recommend and recognize. But if you were to bring forward that, it's certainly something that I would look at with an open mind.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Minister. So we're really short of time, but we're going to try and shoehorn a couple of quick slots. 3 minutes for each party. For the Liberals, 3 minutes for the Conservatives. Other way. Mr. Lloyd, please go ahead.
Minister, would it upset you if you found out that your political staff went behind your back and sought to ask the commissioner to release information?
Are you asking me to speculate on something that there's no evidence of?
Would you be upset if a hypothetical situation happened? If a hypothetical, I'm not asking you to speculate if it happened, I'm asking you if it hypothetically happened, would you be upset about that?
In great respect, Mr. Lloyd, I'm not going to speculate on a hypothetical. I think that would just be silly.
Okay, so you're refusing to say whether you would be upset if your staff went behind your back to politically interfere in an
And again,
investigation.
you're mischaracterizing what I just said to you. I said I'm not going to speculate on your hypotheticals. I think it would be a disservice to this committee.
On April 23rd, Zita Astrovist, your chief of staff, as well as the deputy minister at the time, Rob Stewart, received information about the types of firearms that were covered from the Nova Scotia crime scene. Your office reached out to the RCMP commissioner to ask about what guns were used in the crime scene. Would you agree that that's completely appropriate of your staff to ask that kind of question?
That's part of a briefing.
Okay, that's part of the briefing. Rob Stewart then immediately emailed this list to his Director General for Policy, Randall Coops, asking him, quote, "Are any of these on the to-be-banned list?" Now, this was just days before the May 1st OIC announcements on the firearms being banned. So your deputy minister was already linking what happened in Nova Scotia to the soon-to-be May 1st announcement on firearms. Given that evidence, do you agree that your office was in communications with the RCMP about the firearms used in the Nova Scotia mass shooting, so that this information could then be used at the May 1st announcement?
Yeah, to be really clear, first of all, the deputy minister is in the public service and doesn't.
And your chief of staff.
No, just let me finish, if I may. He was doing his job, and that's his job, to speak to his own officials about this. I recall being advised that we had been provided with that information and that the RCMP had indicated that it was not to be released because of the ongoing investigation. And at all times subsequent to that, until the information was released several months later as a result of an ATIP request, we respected the position of the RCMP. And although we knew that information, we never released it because the RCMP said it shouldn't be and it would compromise their investigation. And we agreed and said it's entirely up to the RCMP to make that decision, not us.
You make that assertion, Minister. If that assertion is true, that the RCMP said this would compromise an investigation, why then would the RCMP commissioner, why then would it have been her idea to release this information?
A question you may wish to put to the RCMP commissioner.
Did it not strike you as odd that you knew that your staff had received an email saying this information is not to be released publicly, and then the RCMP commissioner goes to your staff and says, we're planning on releasing this information publicly?
That's a decision solely the purview of the RCMP. The commissioner, who is the head of that organization, if she makes it a decision with respect to her organization, that's her job and not something that we would ever interfere with.
Thank you.
And didn't.
Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Chang, please. 3 minutes. Have we got Mr. Chang? Here we go.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Minister Blair, in recent weeks, we have heard renewed allegations from opposition parties of political interference between yourself and Commissioner Lucky. These renewed allegations are related to a partial meeting recording that was released between Commissioner Lucky and other RCMP official. Minister, were you a participant of that meeting that was recorded?
No, Mr. Chang, I was not. This was a conversation between the commissioner and her subordinates, and neither I nor anybody who works for me was present.
Thank you, Minister, for answering that question again and again. But if if the recorded meeting was not between yourself and Commissioner Lucky, any allegation of political interference must rely on speculation rather than any actual evidence of or first-hand witness testimony. Would that be correct?
I think it's fair to say that there has been a great deal of speculation, conjecture, innuendo, and even fabrication related to that. And that's why I've worked so hard in the House and before this committee to simply provide the truth.
Thank you so much, Minister. As both of us were former police officers, and given your professional background as a police chief, can you speak a bit more about the independence and why it is so important for independence of police operation? And
yeah, thanks, Mr. Chang. And as I say, it really comes down to the public trust. Frankly, if without the consent and the trust of the people that the police are sworn to serve and protect, the police cannot do their job and they can't keep our communities safe. But the public also needs to trust that the police are acting in the public interest, that they are guided only by the rule of law and not by any political consideration. And that's why that's such a bright line between, and the police are also accountable. You know, we give the police extraordinary authorities, and we give them those authorities with the belief that they will be held accountable. And it's one of the reasons we set up governance bodies such as Police Services Board, with which you and I are quite familiar, and we have sometimes ministers, a Solicitor General in Ontario, for example, who has some ministerial oversight. But the line between our boards and ministerial oversight is a very different one than being able to provide any kind of political direction. The public needs to be assured that the police will be operating in their best interest and following only the rule of law, and that's why it's so important. And that's why, quite frankly, I am so concerned by the innuendo and speculation that's being applied by some in this case, because I think it has the effect of undermining public trust, and it's one of the reasons I've tried so vigorously to assure the public that in this case there was no interference. And I also acknowledge, and I'm grateful for the Commissioner's strong assertions that there was no government interference in this matter or any investigative matter pertaining to the mass shooting in Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. That brings our questioning to a close. Thank you all for being here today, Minister Tupper and Minister Blair. Thank you for your time and for helping us with our inquiries. And with that, we will suspend and bring in our next panel. this meeting back to order. So our second panel, we have from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have Commissioner Brenda Lucki. Welcome, Commissioner. We will give up to 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. So please go ahead, Commissioner, 5 minutes if you will.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This isn't the first time I've testified on the perception of political interference. The released audio recording of the April 28, 2020 meeting makes it abundantly clear. I did not, nor did I attempt to interfere in the criminal investigation into the 2020 mass casualty event in Nova Scotia on behalf of the Minister, Blair, or the Prime Minister. There was no political interference. I was neither asked, directed, nor pressured by government officials to release information specific to the firearms used by the perpetrator in these horrific attacks. I had the information on the firearms, and I had the authority to release it publicly. I did not. I respected the views of my employees that releasing it at the time could impact the investigation. In all my interactions with government officials, I'm aware of my responsibilities as Commissioner and the importance of ensuring foundational principles of police independence. This is so important for the RCMP, for all police services. I would encourage this committee to consider the difference between law enforcement sharing information versus the perception of political interference. As I outlined for this committee in July and at the Mass Casualty Commission, there were requests for information on all aspects of the attacks, including information related to the firearms. And the requests for information were reasonable and did not raise any concerns of political interference or impact the operational independence of the RCMP. As a Commissioner, it's my responsibility to provide accurate, relevant, and timely information to government counterparts and elected officials and their offices. And these were the expectations that I was outlining in the April 28th meeting with my colleagues in Nova Scotia. I was not being briefed with the necessary information about the ongoing operation, and it was for this reason the meeting was called. Those who have listened to the recordings heard that I was frustrated with the information flow from Nova Scotia RCMP, be it related to victims, sites, and the supports provided to RCMP employees. This is in line with my previous testimony before the committee and the MCC. In the lead up to the April 28th press conference, I provided government officials with an overview of information that was being made public. The sharing of the information and briefings with the Minister of Public Safety are necessary, particularly during significant operations or incidents. It is common practice and does not impact the integrity of ongoing investigations or interfere with the independence of the RCMP. It was at this time I was asked if the information about weapons would be included. Following a briefing from my team at National Headquarters confirming the information was to be publicly released, I in turn advised government officials of the same. There was a miscommunication. This is clear on the recording. Sharon Tessier notes that she likely told me that Darren Campbell was going to speak to the weapons in the upcoming press conference and then acknowledged she had in fact misinformed me. During the call, you hear me reference pending gun legislation to help provide context on why it was important to be clear on what we would share. I was not suggesting that the weapons information was needed to inform or support the pending legislation. It was simply about providing context for my employees. In addition to the legislation, there was considerable public interest in knowing about the firearms used in the attacks. This is something seen following other mass shootings, both here and in Canada and in other countries around the world. The desire to keep the public informed was part of the reason why I wanted the information released. We were getting questions at press conferences, and I wanted to be sure that I was providing clear and accurate information about what we could and would say at different points in the days and weeks following the event. As I have already stated, once I was informed by my team that the releasing information would jeopardize the ongoing investigation, the matter was closed, and I passed this along to the Minister's office. I know how important today's discussions are, but I want to reiterate and be very clear for the record. I did not interfere in the investigation. I did not receive direction. I was not influenced by elected or government officials as it relates to the direction of the investigation or the release of the information to the public. I love the RCMP, and I am so honored to be the commissioner, and I'm so incredibly proud of the great work my employees do from coast to coast to coast each and every day, and I'm so thankful for them. I would never impact the operational independence of my organization. Maintaining integrity is absolutely paramount. Following today's testimony, it's my hope that we can quickly move past this conversation in order to help the people of Nova Scotia to continue to heal and keep the focus on those impacted. These discussions are important. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will start our questioning now. We will start with Ms. Dancho, please. Go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here today. In the audio recording, you mentioned specifically a request that you got from the Minister's office. Can you confirm that you did, in fact, get a request from the Minister's office?
There was a request, yes.
From the Chief of Staff, Zita Astravez, she made that request of you?
I believe so, yes.
And the request specifically was to share the weapons information at the April 28th press conference, correct?
Incorrect. The information was not to share the information, just simply a question if, in fact, the information of that press conference would include information about the weapons.
Okay, but she did, so she asked you whether it would be, is what you're saying?
If it would be, yes.
Okay, we've asked the minister several times in the hour before you if that was the case, and he flat out denied that that was real. He denied that his chief of staff would have done that. He denied that his office asked or even knew that you were going to be seeking this information being released. How do you respond to him denying what you said here today, what you said over the summer to us, and what you also said at your testimony at MCC? He's saying that's, in essence, he's saying it's not true.
Well, first and foremost, I didn't deal a lot directly with the minister. I did in the beginning of the event, but more so I was dealing with various people in his staff as well as the Deputy Minister of Public Safety. There was a lot of back and forth. This was, like I said, it was crazy times. There was a lot of phone calls, a lot of different talks. I didn't have my staff with me for the most part because of COVID.
I understand, but the minister, sorry to interrupt, Commissioner, but the minister is saying that this did not happen, that his staff did not ask you to do this.
They didn't ask me to do anything. They just asked a simple question.
Right.
I provided one of the versions because there were several versions of the media event that day, and I provided one of the versions of the speaking notes of Superintendent Darren Campbell.
Yeah.
And in that, they asked if, in fact,
Commissioner.
the information about the
I'm just gonna
weapons
need to interrupt
would
you.
be part of that.
Thank you very
media
much.
release.
You mentioned, though, like even your words now, like it was sort of a simple ask, is this going to be included? You kind of, to me, you seem that you're downplaying this a bit, but when you listen to the audio recording of that meeting, it's very clear that this was very important to you. In fact, you said that you would have to apologize to the minister for not, in essence, delivering on that. So I'm getting a bit of a tension here where you're saying it wasn't that big of a deal. She had this ask. I said, yes, it would be. But then it was a big deal to you, wasn't it? That's
No.
why you called that meeting. That entire audio recording was about this issue.
No, it wasn't about this issue. It was 90% of that meeting was about the issues regarding the flow of information from the start of this incident. There were several requests for several different kinds of information that I wasn't receiving in a timely manner. Some of the information wasn't completely accurate. As mentioned in the recording, I do say that I plan to have this meeting at an earlier time. There was 2 or 3 times or 1 or 2 times that I
Thank
would
you.
have wanted to have the meeting, but I was very conscious of
Thank you. Commissioner, you mentioned you had to apologize to the minister. Did you speak to him and make that apology?
No, I think it was more to his office, and it was about an apology of misinformation. It was
So you
just simply about
apologized-
the fact that
Pardon me, just to clarify, you apologized to his chief of staff?
Yeah, I'm going to say somebody in his office. It was more than likely his chief of staff that I would
Okay.
have said, you know what, sorry, didn't get that.
Understood. So Zita Astravez, the chief of staff, asks you whether you're going to share this information. From our perspective, that would be political pressure. The minister's office, which is the minister, his chief of staff, we know that if it's the minister's chief of staff, it's the minister asking for it. So if the minister's chief of staff is asking whether this information that you connected yourself to the OIC gun control policy coming forward, if that was going to be included in the press conference, to us, that's political pressure from the minister's office. That's the concern here, ma'am.
I appreciate your
And-
perception, but your perception is incorrect.
So, but you understand the perception that you were attempting to further the liberal political agenda
Absolutely
concerning
not.
gun control, but you mentioned it specifically In the audio recording, ma'am. That's irrefutable. You
Absolutely
mentioned
not.
it in, are you denying that you mentioned it in the audio recording?
No, I talked about the gun legislation because if you recall, my very first media event was with Minister Blair. And 1/3 of that was about Nova Scotia. The other 2/3 was actually about gun legislation. Obviously, that was in the news quite a bit. So I was providing context for my staff. You'll also recall that there has been many requests. We had a rule when we provided information to the minister's office that nothing could be released until
Yes,
it was released
thank
by
you.
our folks.
Thank you
That's
very
why
much.
it was important what was released and what wouldn't be released at what time.
Again, you're kind of downplaying the urgency you had with wanting the weapons information released at that press conference, but yet Sharon Tessier, who is the RCMP commissioner or communications lady, she emailed her counterpart in Nova Scotia, quite insistent. She said, please tell me Darren is going to mention the guns. My phone is lighting up. She's saying this to her during the press conference, clearly indicating there's serious urgency from her, who she answers to you, correct? That why isn't this information being released? So if you're looking at this all together, Commissioner, it is very difficult for us to sort of believe the narrative that this wasn't that big a deal, that you weren't trying to further the Liberal political agenda, because in the audio recording, you make it evident, you make the connection. Your staff are really harassing the Nova Scotia staff, saying, why isn't this information being released? You understand the perception. That's why you're here today. And I may say the minister denied any of this. He denied that his chief of staff asked this of you. Don't you find that odd that he's saying what you said in committee here and in testimony was incorrect?
No, there was a lot of information going back and forth. And what I will say is that, it's important to note that there was a lot of requests of when are we going to release the names of the victims? When are we going to release the locations of each and every location of the deceased? There was lots of information because they could not speak about it until we did. So it wasn't unusual to ask if, in fact, information was going to be included. And the firearms was only one of several requests. So we're making it all about the firearms, but really it wasn't all about the firearms. And my meeting that was just one example of many others. There was a chronology I was looking for. There was a map I was looking for. There was some timelines that I was looking for. These were all expectations that I had that had not been met. And the firearms was but one of those.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll have to cut you off there. Thank you, Ms. Dancho. We go now to Ms. Demoff, please. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here again, Commissioner. The recording that was released is a partial recording. It starts mid-conversation, so we don't know what transpired beforehand. And there's been accusations made here that you're not telling the truth. So I'm just going to, Commissioner, did the minister or his staff direct you in any way prior to your conversation with the Nova Scotia RCMP?
There was no direction provided whatsoever.
And is it normal, Commissioner, for the minister's office to ask questions about, in particular in this case, which was the worst mass shooting in Canadian history? Is it not normal that the minister or his staff would be asking you questions about what was transpiring?
Absolutely, each and every day. And despite this event, this happens weekly, this happens daily. Obviously, in preparation for question period, we get lots of questions as well. But in a major event like this, it's not unusual for us to provide information, we get clarifying questions back, we clarify that if we can. That's part and parcel of part of my responsibilities.
So, Commissioner, I read the transcript of the call that you had with the Nova Scotia RCMP, and we've heard accusations that you were overly emotional during the call. What I read and what I heard was a commissioner who was echoing the frustration that all Canadians had about the lack of communication being provided by the Nova Scotia RCMP. Were you being overly emotional, Commissioner, or were you in fact holding the Nova Scotia RCMP to account as Commissioner?
I appreciate that you say all this because I was very careful of being calm. I knew that they were feeling, very traumatized by what was going on. There was a lot of pressure put on them each and every day during this event with 22 crime scenes and a lot of information. It's never pleasant to have a conversation when somebody's not meeting your expectations. That's why I thought about it. I didn't have it earlier on. I was very tempered in my approach. I was very calm. I didn't make it personal. It was more about the behavior and how we can move forward to meet our expectations.
Earlier in questioning it, you were accused of harassing the Nova Scotia RCMP. People in your position as commissioner need to have hard conversations with people who work for you. Would you consider this a hard conversation, or were you harassing the Nova Scotia RCMP?
It was a difficult conversation because they were, they didn't have the capacity. It was very, there was a lot of negative narrative coming out in the media, so it was very difficult. And that was why it was so crucial that I have this conversation so we could be more proactive and more strategic about our communications.
Well, Commissioner, I know you probably won't say it, but as a woman, you've been labeled as being overly emotional, as harassing your staff. Your judgment has been called into question, and we see this repeatedly for women in leadership positions, that when they're being assertive and doing their job, that they're accused of being overly emotional, or if it was a man in that position, I don't think that the same questions would be asked. I don't know if you would agree with that or not, Commissioner, and I know you probably...
It's difficult times for all leaders, and I find it difficult, especially when my integrity is being questioned, because as a police officer, I pride myself on my integrity, and having over 37 years of policing, to have my integrity questioned by anybody, I find it a bit offensive, actually.
Well, you have been repeatedly assured us that you were not provided with any direction from the minister's office. As I said, when I read the transcript, I saw someone doing their job in holding the RCMP to account. That's what we expect the commissioner to do in taking her job forward. So I'm not sure how much time I've got left, Chair, but okay. On the order in council to prohibit the firearms, Commissioner, did the RCMP provide input in creating the order in council, and how long would you have been working with the minister's office on that?
On any legislation, if it affects policing, we're always, not only ourselves, but all of the policing community under the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. This would have been going on for a couple of years. It's no different than the cannabis legislation or online harms. Any legislation that's going to affect policing, and especially in enforcement, we would absolutely be consulted along with our other colleagues.
So the fact that you brought up pending firearms legislation is you're not betraying any confidences. You're not. In fact, the Nova Scotia RCMP probably should have been aware as well that this was coming forward. But this had nothing to do with impending legislation, but rather just stating a fact that was well known by Canadians.
Absolutely, it wasn't going to change anything in future dealings, and it wouldn't affect the integrity of any investigation as well.
Thank you. And I noticed after the incident in Saskatchewan, the response from the RCMP seemed to have improved. Would you say that there were lessons learned after Nova Scotia in terms of communications with the public?
Absolutely. In fact, at the beginning of that event, I called in the person who was overseeing the Mass Casualty Commission on behalf of the RCMP, just to make sure that no mistake was ever repeated during that. And the flow of information in an event like Nova Scotia, I should be briefed minimally 2 times a day. I had 2 briefings in 6 days. So that shows you that the flow of information was not there. And I don't like to point fingers because, a small division like that would not have the capacity that a bigger division would have. And so, like in the recording, you hear Ms. Scanlon talk about 4 people and working 20 hours a day. That's a tough go to try to, get the information out to the Canadian public and the Nova Scotians, and they deserve no less.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Ms. Demont. Madame Michaud.
Ms. Michaud, please, 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for your presence here. It's much appreciated. During the meeting on April 20th, 2020, we received the transcript of it, and you said
from the minister's office, and I shared with the minister that in fact it was going to be in the news release, and it wasn't. Vous mentionnez donc
you mentioned a certain request Can you provide more details on that request in particular, who it came from, whether it was the minister himself, his office, a member of his team in particular?
It definitely wasn't from the minister. It would have been from his office and probably the chief of staff, Zita Astrova. It was not, it was just more of a confirmation after getting the speaking notes. I would imagine they'd already gotten a copy of the one of the versions of the speaking notes of Superintendent Darren Campbell, and it was more of a clarifying question if in fact the information on the weapons, would be included in that media release.
Est-ce que c'est de votre avis?
Is it your opinion that the government, via the minister's office or via the prime minister's office, only wanted the information or perhaps wanted to control the message that would be put out during the press conference?
No, absolutely not. There was no question about the content or what type of information would be provided. It was simply about if it was going to be provided. And it wasn't just the minister's office requesting. It was the media. It was other government bureaucrats asking. It was people within our organization. We were trying to get the information out as timely as we could.
Dans le même transcript.
In the same transcript, you say that you've already received a request from the minister's office to follow up on what was said during the press conference. You say you'll have to apologize, that you'll need to have a conversation with him after the press conference. And earlier when I asked the question to the minister, he said he didn't recall a conversation he had with you following the press conference. Is that your memory as well? Was there a conversation between you, between your offices? And if so, what was the topic of that discussion?
There was no specific conversation with the minister on this. I believe it was more of a back and forth on email, and it was basically saying that, in fact, when I say it, when I refer to an apology, it's basically you asked if the information was going to be included. I advised you that it was. Sorry, that was not the case. I was misinformed. I was given the wrong information, and it was not, in fact, included. It did, in fact, get included in a question and answer later on, and that's when, in that particular meeting, that is when I was actually advised that no further information would be given because it might affect integrity of future investigations. That was relayed back to bureaucrats and the minister's office saying we won't be speaking any further about the weapons at this point, and that was the end of the conversation.
Dans les transcripts, vous...
In the transcript, you seem to be upset that you didn't receive some information, and you even said it during some testimony. Do you think that the minister's office and perhaps the prime minister's office were also upset to not have received certain pieces of information or that some information wasn't released to the public? Is it your feeling that there might have been a feeling that ministers were upset, as you were, that some information was not released?
I would first like to clarify I was never upset. That's not in my nature. I was frustrated with the flow of communication. The fact that we were getting requests daily from the media asking us when such information would be released, when the information about the weapons was going to be released, when more background on the perpetrator was going to be released, the information about the incident at the fire hall, the replica police car. There was an insatiable appetite of information from the media, from Canadians, from Nova Scotians, who had a right to know what was going on, and it was so important. And I felt that when we didn't give that information proactively, I know exactly what happens in those cases. The media looks to other sources of information, and those sources are not always the best source of information. The best source of information is the police, and so we need to be proactive and strategic in our communications, just as we were, if you saw in the James Smith Cree Nation. There was regular media briefs for people, so there was no questions out floating amongst the media asking, what about this and what about this? Why did it not happen in Saskatchewan? Because there was regular information. We just didn't have that ability in Nova Scotia with the onset of the pandemic.
Mon souvenir était que...
My recollection is that when the minister came in July, he said there wasn't necessarily a link between having announced made the May 1st announcement a few days after the killings in Portapique, that it was a coincidence, that it was at about the same time, that since 2018 he'd been working on that prohibition of certain firearms. And now today, if I've understood correctly, he's confirmed that it was desired that the firearms that were used during the mass murder, that they would be included in the prohibition that he announced. Do you think it's a positive thing to proceed in that fashion, or do you think that the government should be more proactive and not wait that a specific firearm be used in a murder to prohibit it? I believe, in any case, that they should be more proactive. I don't know what you think.
Well, I believe that any time that we can keep Canadians safe from getting guns off the street, whatever guns those or weapons that those are, that's a positive for Canadians, keeping Canadians safe, especially weapons that are designed to kill. The legislation that happened on May 5th, I didn't even know that that was coming out. I had no idea. I didn't connect that to the conversation here. Mine was more of a general conversation to my staff to say, you know what, part of the, if you haven't heard on the news, every second media event besides the events in Nova Scotia are about the pending gun legislation. So let's keep this in context and let's, have the big picture when we're talking about the media event. So I think, going back to your original question, it's always important to get guns that kill people off the streets.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Madame. Mr. McGregor, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Lucky, for appearing. So just for clarity here, the word request, when it's referenced twice in the transcript, you're stating clearly that that wasn't a request from the minister's office to include stuff. It was a request if things would be included. Yes. Okay. There's a further quote in the transcript, that's got Leah Scanlon and then followed by Dan Bryan, and Dan Bryan, the RCMP Media Relations Director. They both made reference to the Deputy Commissioner Brennan. And Dan Bryan in particular stated, and I quote, "We got the message from Leah's team member that the Deputy Commissioner wanted the handguns included in terms of number and type, and then we changed the answer knowing we were just literally minutes away from having the text loaded up for posting." I guess just for some clarity, like you were in on the call because you did interrupt a little bit further down. When the Deputy Commissioner is referenced to having wanted the number and the type included, I guess, who ultimately, during the course of this investigation, makes that call about the appropriateness of information being released?
Well, first, there's a command triangle. The command triangle would go through any request if you were looking at, in our case, we want to be more proactive in getting the information out. If, in fact, it would compromise the integrity of an investigation, the command triangle would say, we can provide the number of weapons, we can provide the general type, we can't get into makes, models, where they were found, but we can generally talk about this. Okay, that's great, and that's exactly what happened. Nobody was asking for specific information. We were asking for the number of weapons, because 22 people had been killed by weapons. And so, of course, there was, everybody wanted to know what type of weapons were being used. And that would go through the command triangle. I wouldn't make that information. We also had a rule for anybody doing media that only the information released first by the RCMP would be talked about publicly. So that's, in fact, why sometimes that would be why a request, are you going to be talking about the victims? Are you going to be talking about, are you releasing names? Because they couldn't talk about the names until we released the names, even if they were out in the media. They couldn't talk about the weapons unless we talked about the weapons. So there was always a back and forth when we were talking about media. And I know the deputy and myself were really trying to get the Nova Scotia comms team in a good position to be more proactive and more strategic.
Thank you. And then further on, you made reference to this in your opening statement, when your quote is saying, does anybody realize what's going on in the world of handguns and guns right now, the fact that they're in the middle of trying to get legislation going. I think I was writing notes as you were speaking, and you said that it was important for the team to kind of understand the context. Can you clarify what you meant there? Like why did you feel it was important in the midst of this conversation that they understand that, you know, the government of the day had an OIC coming up fairly soon?
It wasn't really specifically about an OIC. It was about
Legislation in general?
Yeah, legislation in general was looming. It was talked about every day in the media. It was talked about in a media event that I did with the minister. And so obviously it was important. It was coming out. It was more about providing context as to how this information would be linked possibly, or could be linked into legislation, like the fact that it provides people context. Sometimes we talk about things on why we do things, why they're important. I said, don't be like in my mind, and I testified about this on previous occasions, is we can't be naive about what's going on around us. So, of course, people are interested in this. They might be interested in the legislation. They might be interested in, you know, the weapons that killed people in Nova Scotia. Everybody wanted information on that, and I always had to refer and say, sorry, I can't release that at this time. Like, there was lots of times, but I don't understand myself, and the deputy and I were pushing why we couldn't go with the numbers of weapons and the general types.
Thank you. We've already covered a little bit too about the statute that governs the organization, specifically Section 5.1, what provides for your appointment under the direction of the minister to have control and management of the force. In the previous round, you know, I mentioned that there are, you know, a couple of provincial police acts that have a lot more specificity in the division of powers, and also abroad, you know, specifying how the minister may not give directions, like when it comes to enforcement of the law, ongoing investigations. I think our act is quite vague compared to those other examples. Would you agree with that? And given the vagueness of Section 5.1, like, how do you understand where that line is when other jurisdictions have taken the time to clearly put that dividing line down?
The line is not, the line is so obvious. There is no, you know, it's not, the line's not thin on this. The line's very thick, and it's, asking for information is not providing direction. Requesting information, me providing information about the biggest mass casualty in Canadian history is not interference. It's part of my responsibility as commissioner to make sure there's no surprise environment for both the minister, the prime minister. The prime minister and the minister should get information before the media does. I get requests from across the country from members of parliament. They get questions from their constituents. I get letters all the time asking for information. We reply to those and give the information when we can. That's part and parcel of the relationship between government officials. Our detachment commanders do it with the mayors. Our commanding officers do it with the premiers. This happens weekly, daily in some cases. So there is no line for me, but obviously the fact that I've had to testify on this 3 or 4 times means that we need some clarity here, because I don't wish this on any other commissioner going forward to have to respond to this again.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. That ends round 1 of questions. We go to the second round. We will have to abbreviate this second round with 1 slot for each party, as per usual. So we'll start with Mr. Lloyd. 5 minutes,
Thank you.
please.
And what we all want is clarity here. So in the minister's testimony just previous to you coming here, he said it was your idea to release the information about the guns, that it came from yourself. Is that the truth?
Well, that was part of it. In that particular example where I explained that I got a request if the guns were going to be included, I was also asking about the guns in previous conversations with my comms team.
But you independently decided that it would be helpful for the information about the guns to be released.
We talked about various chunks of information. We talked about when the victims' names were going to be released, the crime scenes, when they were, the different crime scenes, a chronology, about the replica police car. We talked about being proactive, because every time we did a media release, our comms folks will do a scan of what is out there, and that will tell us what we should do next.
The minister said you told the deputy minister, Robert Stewart, and his chief of staff, Zita Astroves, that you wanted to release the information about the guns. Is that the truth? That's what the minister just said. before this committee?
First, it was, the question that I got from the minister's office was if the guns were to be released. Getting into the details of what was going to be released in the media, in that media event, was not discussed at all with Nova Scotia.
So are you saying it was not your idea to release information about the guns?
No, it was actually the people on the ground.
It was the Nova Scotia RCMP that decided that the guns needed to be released.
So what happens is, as I explained before, there was multiple types of information. So when we could release information, it would be released.
So on April 23rd, you were part of an email chain where CERT said, this information is only to be released internally. And you told the Prime Minister's office and the Minister's office that this was only for internal distribution. Just 5 days later, you were on a call with your staff, and you said, why was this information not included in the public media availability? During those 5 days, did you receive any emails or confirmations from CERT that this information should now be released publicly?
No, that information that we got was not, there was no intention to release the detail of that information. That was very detailed information. There was no intention to release that. All we were looking at, to be proactive, is the number of weapons and the general types of weapons. That's the information we were looking at, and that was the questions I was getting asked from the media. I myself was curious as to why that was not happening.
But the staff on the ground were worried that this could compromise an ongoing investigation. Why would just the number of weapons and the general type of weapons have any impact on the investigation?
It wouldn't.
So then why would your staff be concerned?
And it was released.
Well, it wasn't released till quite some time later, the specific details.
No, it was released in the Q&A of that media
Very
event.
general information,
Yeah, and that's all
handgun
we
and
were
assault
looking at.
weapon.
That's all we were looking for.
That's all you were looking for.
Just the general information, the number of weapons and the general type of weapons. It wasn't, the details that you saw in that email, there was no question that that was not, that information was not to be released, and it was even caveated as such.
Now, in your transcript, you continually reference, you talk about the minister's office, but you also talk about the minister, and you said you have a request to have a call from the minister. You know what it's going to be about. What was that call with the minister about?
Well, there was a few requests that had not been completed, like the chronology. I pride myself on giving the correct information. I pride myself on giving information in a timely manner. So if I say to you, Mr. Lloyd, that I'm going to give you information tomorrow by 4 o'clock, I'm expecting to have the information tomorrow by 4 o'clock. If I don't get you the information by 4 o'clock, I'm going to phone you up and say, you know what, I'm sorry, I didn't get you the information.
And that's the same for when you commit that information is going to be shared publicly at a media release? That is the same thing?
No, it was, yeah, when the minister asked if that information, the minister's office asked if that information was going to be part of the media event, I have no idea. I'm not controlling the media event. I talked to my comms people go to the comms people on the ground. They told me, yes, in fact, the general details about the weapons would be included. I tell them it will be included. They're probably, in my mind, what I'm thinking is they're preparing for when they're in front of the media, that they will be, in fact, be able to talk about that once it's released, because until it's released by us, they could not talk about it.
And, sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair. So you were frustrated because you had to do this multiple times with the minister in his office. There was multiple times that there was information that was incorrectly given because, as you said, you pride yourself on giving people the correct information, and that was the reason why you had to call the minister and that you were upset about having to talk to the minister again, saying that you had dropped the ball again.
I wasn't upset.
Not with your staff necessarily, upset with yourself, you were saying.
No, and I was frustrated with the information that I wasn't getting as well. That was what the meeting was about. Yes, in fact, there was times when the minister didn't get the information, but there was more times that I didn't get the information. And the flow of information was not the usual speed and pace and flow. We usually get a rhythm going. There was no rhythm in the flow of information. And that's why I called the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. We'll go now to Mr. Nur Mohammed, please. 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for joining us. it's disappointing that so much has been made by some in this committee to try to undermine your credibility. I think there's such an obsession with trying to find a smoking gun where one doesn't exist that your reputation seems to have been what people have chosen to put in the crossfire. And I do want to apologize for that. But I do also want to take this time to try to clarify a few things so that there can be no misapprehension about what actually happened. In your testimony, you noted that you were asked if certain information would be included. When questions of you are asked if something is to be included, do you see that as a direction? Do you take that as a direct direction, or do you see that as a question for information?
No, not at all. Direction would be telling me what to do.
Well, let's talk about direction. Did Minister Blair ever direct you to do anything in respect to this investigation?
He has never directed me in this investigation or any other investigation during my time as commissioner.
What about his chief of staff, Zita Astravas? Did Zita Astravas ever direct you to do anything in respect to this investigation?
Never.
What about the Prime Minister? What about the Prime Minister's office? Did the Prime Minister's office ever direct you to do anything?
No, they have not.
What about the Prime Minister himself?
No, he has not.
What about the Prime Minister's staff? Prime Minister's staff?
No, they have not. I have received requests for information, but not direction.
What about other staff in the Minister of Public Safety's office? Did they ever direct you to do anything?
No, administratively, I have actually had ministerial directives on specific administrative matters, but nothing in the operational realm.
Nothing in the operational realm. If the minister were to direct you to do something in the operational realm, what would your response be?
Sorry, I cannot provide you the information. I cannot do that. You're crossing the line. There's a number of things I could say. I've never had to do that, but sorry?
And you would say those things, is that correct?
Absolutely. I have the courage of conviction to do that. That's why I'm commissioner.
You know, a lot has been made of what appears to be this desire to paint you as being angry or upset on this phone call. And I just want to stop for a moment and ask you, as you look back, how much of that perceived frustration or whatever people will try to call it was about the lack of information and the lack of clarity you were getting from your team in Nova Scotia versus this idea that you were somehow disappointing the minister?
About 95 or more percent was about the flow or lack of flow of information, and that's where my frustration was stemming from.
And just to be clear, what percentage came out of this perceived direction that some members claim you had received?
Well, I said this in previous testimonies. This was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Getting the wrong information from my staff was yet another example of what was happening throughout those past 7 to 10 days.
Just to be clear, it was not in request. It was not in response to any direction, because as you've said in this testimony, you received no such direction, correct?
Exactly.
So I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked the minister. You know, there is a very real problem, I think, when parliamentarians choose to act in a way that undermines the credibility of our police services at times of crisis. What would you say to Canadians that are watching this, who have heard the minister unequivocally state that there was no political interference, who have now heard you unequivocally go through all of the people that could possibly have directed you to do something, and you said none of them gave you direction? And I think that's greatly reassuring to me. But what would you say to Canadians to give them the confidence that their police services and the RCMP in particular are independent of political interference and have been in the case of what happened in Nova Scotia?
Well, I would like to say to Canadians that they should have every confidence in not only the RCMP, but the other 193 police agencies across Canada. Because each and every day, the police officers of the RCMP are out in the communities 24/7 trying to keep Canadians safe. They're doing everything they can to ensure the safety of Canadians, making thorough investigations, bringing people to justice, and this is part and parcel what we do, and we do it very well. And we're a police agency of excellence, and we do so many things so well. And I would like Canadians to have confidence not only in the RCMP but in their police in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed. Thank you, Commissioner. I will go now. Madame Michaud, 2 minutes.
Madame Michaud, you have 2 minutes and a half. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I was reading the transcription that was made public, and the regional team seemed to think that it was a bad idea to divulge the type of arm because it could compromise the inquiry. This is what I could understand. But while you were answering a question earlier, you said that this was the idea of the people on the ground, that they wanted to divulge the type of arm that was used. Could you please clarify their intention? Why did they want to divulge this information? Did it come from the people on the ground? Was it the government? Or was it your team from the RCMP?
No, thanks for asking that clarifying question. This was, in fact, the question was asked if this information was to be included. I thought it was a really great question because I felt that at this point, given this was a huge media event, they had planned it for days, and the speaking notes were they were very, very fluid. It was something that was going on very quickly, and so it was important that we included as much information as possible. And so they did speak about a 1 or 2 liner in these in this transcription. They talked about doing a 1 or 2 liner that they did not want to put in the speaking notes, but they were going to bring it out in the question and answer, and that was their idea. Not I didn't get into any specifics on how it should be done or why it should be done. It was just specifically, are you going to include it? And they said yes. So I had no reason to ask what needed to be included because they told me it was going to be included.
Merci.
Thank you. Radio-Canada told us this morning that the American who gave some of the arms that were used during the shooting cannot be a witness in front of the commission. He said that he got rid of all of his arms, and the RCMP and the commission continued investigating on what was happening in Maine, where he bought the arms, and they had been brought illegally to Canada. So this seems to prove that you had to be very prudent with this investigation, and the fact of divulging some information earlier or during the days following the shooting, this could compromise the inquiry.
Please go answer quickly, please.
Yes, that's why it's important to go back to the command triangle and ensure that we don't release information that could compromise an investigation. Giving the number and the general type of firearms used would not have compromised that investigation. And we were told, and the investigator in charge of not the investigator, but Darren Campbell, who was in charge of the command triangle, in fact released that in a Q&A. Why? Because it would not compromise the integrity of the investigation. And I would never ask that information that would compromise an investigation be included in any media.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. McGregor, 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, I'd like to ask you about Dan Bryan. It's, of course, from his phone that we have the transcript. Did he announce to all of the participants that he was recording the call?
No, he did not.
Okay. Is that something that he normally does? And you know, is that justifiable? I mean, usually you have to get the consent of people first.
Yeah, the normal procedure is to get consent, and in a, if you notice on a Teams environment, you can see when the recording button is on, but nobody was aware that he was recording. Nobody was aware.
And of course, the story of how it ended up on his phone and the different stories we've gotten about whether it existed, whether it was deleted, whether the phone was stolen. You know, they had his personal phone, I believe. A forensic unit managed to get 3 audio files adding up to nearly 24 minutes. What do you have to say about the fact that he recorded this on a personal device? I mean, this is a very high-profile briefing. This is you as the commissioner with your direct deputies in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, this is part and parcel of a complete security review and an administrative review. And so I would hold judgment until I get all the information because I have no idea what the intent was, if it was for nefarious reasons or not. And I don't have all the information in front of me. I do know that we did go through all of the RCMP devices in the first instances because we control those devices. And it wasn't until we were given the personal device of Mr. Bryan that we were able to retrieve those. And that was within the day of receiving that device.
Yeah, and of course, lawyers representing the families before the Mass Casualty Commission have remarked about how helpful it would have been to have had the recording during the time when they were doing the cross-examination. I can see you nodding and you would agree to that. But I guess I understand you want to wait for the investigation to run its course, but have you taken steps for future conference calls to make sure that operationally sensitive information is not being recorded on someone's personal phone?
Well, yeah, that's part of our departmental security policies and procedures. And so if it is found that those policies and procedures were not followed, then in fact, Mr. Bryan will be held to account for that.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. So that wraps up our questioning. Thank you, Commissioner, for being with us today and for assisting us in our inquiries. I would like to advise the committee that it looks like we'll be able to finish witness testimony on Thursday for C-21. So I'm asking everyone to get their amendments in by close of business on the following Thursday so that we can take up clause by clause the following week. So with that, thank you all for Madam Mitchell. Wait a minute.
Si vous pouvez clarifier, Monsieur le Président.
If you could clarify, Mr. Chair, you said that we had...
Mr. Chair, we said we were going to...
You had agreed to another...
Meet... But are you going to say that we're going to have another meeting for C-21 on Thursday? Are we going to have... Are you saying that we're having two meetings on Thursday? What are you saying exactly, please?
Yes. The clerk and I were panhandling for meeting slots last week, trying to arrange this meeting. We managed to get
Why,
Thursday.
Mr. Chair? Why is that? We didn't skip any meetings for this, so why are we having an extra meeting on Thursday?
Well, because we were able to get the slot, because we thought we were going to have this meeting then.
Mm-hmm. This is the extra slot. We did not agree to having another meeting on Thursday.
We didn't have this slot then. The whips have been advised. The whips are aware of this, and I would urge you to take it up with the whips. But that's currently the plan is to finish up on C-21 on Thursday, so that we can go ahead with clause by clause the week after the consent week.
So. Point of order, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, we did not agree to that. We didn't even discuss that as a committee. The motion in good faith put in a clause that if this meeting that happened today were to overtake a C-21 meeting, that we would have an extra meeting. But because that did not happen, there was no conversation amongst all parties. There was nothing on the record. We did not agree to that. So that is something that you unilaterally did without our consent? Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, in good faith, the clerk and I set up a meeting on Thursday for this meeting.
Right.
Because that's when we thought we would be able to have the commissioner and the minister here. And
that's in the evening on Thursday?
Yes.
There are individuals who fly home Thursday night, so...
I'm one of those. I can't go home either. It's a terrible time for a meeting.
I think that we should probably discuss this Tuesday at the first meeting.
Absolutely. But as it stands now, we're currently scheduled for that, and I'm hoping that we can, if we go ahead with this, that we will be able to get onto clause by clause the week after. I just want to give you notice today so you have more time to prepare amendments. I'm sure you've all got amendments in the queue ready to go. But anyway, so with that, we're over time and we're slowing down the other committees. So thank you all for your time today. And with that, we are adjourned.